Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do some practice with understanding the tools of the limited reserves framework of monetary policy and how those tools will actually fix an output gap. So let's get started. Okay, so this first part just tells us match the scenario with the correct limited reserves policy. And so the first thing that I'm going to actually encourage you to do as you're reading these is think about, am I in a recession or I am in an expansion? And the first one says the economy is above full employment output. So that makes us in an expansion. If we're in an expansion, we want to raise the discount rate, and that would make it more expensive to borrow, and that would bring aggregate demand back down. I also want to raise the required reserve because that would also make there to be less money supply out there, which would raise interest rates and reduce aggregate demand. And last, I could sell bonds because that would make the money supply smaller, and that would also raise the interest rate, again, reducing aggregate demand. For part two, economy has cyclical unemployment. That tells me that we're in a recession. If we're in a recession, we want more aggregate demand, and so I would lower the discount rate to make it cheaper for banks to borrow from the central bank and ultimately increase the amount of money and lower interest rates. I could lower the reserve ratio, which allows banks to lend more, and it allows the money supply to increase, lowering interest rates. And I could buy bonds, and that would directly increase the money supply, thereby lowering the interest rate. I'm going to make it fairly quick for the other ones because they're really just, if you can remember what this is in a recession or an expansion. When potential is greater than the actual, that means we're in a recession. So we're going to go down, down, and buy. When the economy is below full employment, that's still a recession. Down, down, buy. When actual unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment, that's what that means. Natural rate of unemployment. If the actual is less than that, then that means we're actually in an expansion. So I would raise the discount rate, raise the required reserves, and sell bonds. And then last, if my full is bigger than my equilibrium, that means that I'm in a recession. So I'm going to lower the discount rate, lower the reserve ratio, and buy bonds. Let's take a look at this set here. These are two little flow charts of kind of what will happen when, if we are in a recession, the central bank should, well, I can say, buy bonds. You could have also said lower the reserve ratio. You could have also said lower the discount rate. Any of those would allow banks to lend more, increase the money supply. That's going to decrease the interest rate and make it cheaper for people to borrow. Therefore, consumption will rise, aggregate demand would increase, and output would increase back to full employment. In a recessionary gap, we would want to sell bonds. An expansionary gap. We just did the recession. In an expansionary gap, we would want to sell bonds, raise the reserve ratio, and raise the discount rate. That would make banks able to lend less, the money supply would decrease, and interest would rise. As a result of the higher interest, consumption would fall, aggregate demand would fall, and output would go back to full employment. Now, the last question here is a bank balance sheet that we've looked at a couple of times already in this class. Let me see if I can get there. There we go. Suppose the central bank buys 5,000 of bonds from the Bank of Ladue. So when that happens, if they do that, this is going to go to zero, and this is going to go to $5,000. And so how much in excess reserves do they now hold? Well, they now hold $5,000. How much in total do they hold? 10 plus 5 is $15,000. How much in liabilities do they hold? Well, if you count these as the pure liabilities, you can say 90,000. I would be okay with 100,000 if you wanted to include the owner's equity. That's really not a big deal. But really, what we're saying here is that liabilities don't change. When the assets are just changing. And in fact, the total amount of assets aren't changing, right? You can add it up and still see they didn't change how much they have. It just transformed one type of asset into another. Immediate change in the money supply, there's going to be an increase of $5,000 because there is literally now 5,000 more excess reserves. That's counted as part of the monetary base, right? That's part of MB. And so MB went up by 5,000. What's the maximum possible change in the money supply? Well, if they lend all that out, 5,000 times 1 over 0.2, that's going to be equal to $25,000. Now, how did I get that 0.2? If you just remember this one and this one, right? 0.2 is equal to 10,000 over 50,000. It's the required reserves, the amount over the demand deposits. So that's where that 0.2 is coming from. And if instead an individual had deposited 5,000 in cash, would the maximum change be larger, smaller, or the same? Well, it's going to be smaller smaller because the 20% required reserve applies to the deposit. So we can actually say the first loan of 4,000 times 5 gives us a 20,000 increase in the supply of money. And so you can see here that the supply of money goes up by 25,000 when the central bank buys the bonds, but only 20,000 when someone actually walks in, makes a deposit. Hopefully this helped you with understanding the basics of the limited reserves framework and how that works. I'll see you next time.